Hey everyone, welcome back to Berlin Noir. Today we're going to be staying in the same area we were in the previous episode, and we'll be working on a large stadium here in the city, the Post Stadium, as it was called, and still is called today. Here's the aerial view of it back in the late 1920s, pretty much wedged between the rail yard there you see on the right and a park on the left side. And it was actually built on the former grounds of like an old Prussian cavalry parade ground. So it was a pretty large open area for some time, and they filled it in here with a general kind of sports complex. There was also like tennis courts and things like that in the area. But so I guess it was originally built for the German post, the Reichspost. So I'm not exactly sure how it's such an odd concept to have a stadium built for the post office league, more or less. So someone who's more familiar on that, give me the background on that, because that's just a very interesting thing. Just that an entire fancy stadium would be built only for the sports club of the German post office, essentially. It just seems funny, I don't know. But yeah, so that's why it's called Post Stadium. And it was built in 1929, and for a few years, up until 1936, which is when the Olympic Stadium was built, it was pretty much Berlin's main largest stadium here. So it was relevant for a short time, I guess. Even though during the Olympics it did hold some events, but of course compared to the actual Olympic Stadium, it was much smaller. So, and then after World War II, it fell into disrepair for a while, and then it was more or less just recently renovated. So in the early 2000s, it saw its first round of renovations, which basically cleaned it up because it was kind of being reclaimed by nature to some extent. And then in the 2010s, I think they kind of did another round of renovations, especially on the main grandstands, which didn't change a whole lot, pretty much remained the exact same as they were back when they were built in 1929, so that's cool to see. But one big thing that did change is the number of seats. Basically, when this was built back then, as you can see, I did one row of seats all the way around. I used actual staircases, and then using one of the mods, I can kind of widen it to make it look a little bit more like seating. But there was an additional row on top of that. So basically there was two large areas of seating, just your typical, I guess, bowl stadium that you'd see all around the world, more or less. But once it was rebuilt, renovated in the early 2000s, most of the seating was gone. So today you only have a small bit of it, at least according to the Wikipedia article. It seats about 10,000 now, compared to at its peak, it actually held up to 45,000, which is pretty crazy because it doesn't quite look to hold that many people. But I assume it was probably had some sort of expansion after it was built to accommodate a few more, especially for the Olympics later on. But yeah, nonetheless, I wanted to really focus on the stadium, really kind of make it custom, because there really wasn't anything on the workshop that I could have used for this. I mean, I guess some simple generic things. I do recall one kind of semi-sunken stadium, which is what I looked for initially on the workshop. But I do recall it being pretty modern, and I couldn't find it anyways. I looked for a little while, couldn't find it, but I probably wasn't going to be able to use it anyways, because like I said, it was pretty modern. And of course, this is built in the late 1920s, so definitely different vibe, different architecture going on. So I figured I could do what I do enjoy doing a lot, at least when I have the opportunity to, and using these PO cubes to basically build it from scratch. So, like I said already, I used the stair networks as the kind of base for the seating, and then I used the PO cubes to recreate this grandstand here. But this is where I really wanted to focus in the episode, building this, really trying to make it accurate, look like it did back then. But I must say, initially, I just kind of wanted to make a general shape that resembled it pretty well, but not, didn't go not too crazy on the details. But basically, I just kept going and going. For what like I said, like initially wanting to keep it relatively simple, but in the end, I pretty much replicated it 100% as it was. and I really like how it turned out. So I'm glad I did that, and I'm glad I spent as much time as I did recreating this. So this is going to be the bulk of the episode, really, because while this kind of general sports complex is pretty large, I cut out everything that's pretty much not the stadium. So like the tennis courts nearby, I ended up cutting out just because this episode would have been way too long, and all the buildings surrounding this I also cut out because that would have been way too long. And of course, yeah, they're just buildings, and I guess not super duper exciting, and this is at least unique enough that I wanted to really focus enough time on. But so this technique here is using the PO cubes and then my own textures that I found online. So I'll link in the video description basically the entire process of how you go about doing this, since I actually made a 10-minute tutorial already about a year or so ago on this process here, how you can find any sort of textures you want, and then how you can make them, put them in games so you can use them as I am now. But yeah, this is just something I really do enjoy doing ever since I saw Comrade Intense do it a while ago in his Soviet city. There's a lot of cool things you can do with it, and maybe 10-15 episodes ago, once I kind of took a hiatus from the channel, but once I came back, the very first episode back, we built I believe the Europa house, and used this exact same technique with these PO cubes to build that as well, and it turned out pretty cool as well. So especially when you have kind of blocky buildings that aren't too fancy, especially the facade, right? So your typical, old 18th century, 19th century European building, you're not going to want to use this to recreate anything like that, just because, of course, those are very intricate, the details, and they're very fancy. And this is pretty much really only good for using more blocky, more modern buildings. So, of course, in the 20s, 30s, and even afterwards, the focus was less so on making really incredibly intricate facades, and more so with practicality, keeping costs lower. So that's one thing that is nice about doing the series in the 1920s, is you do have the opportunity to use this here, which otherwise, in I guess an earlier time period in European history, you definitely would not be able to use this. But so basically this entire building is made out of just those two textures. So just kind of that yellow plaster texture, and then this brick texture, this brick texture here, which is all that I could see on the building in real life. Very, very simple, but it definitely made it simpler to recreate, because I did want to add those brick kind of highlights, just to add a little more pop, a little more color, but I was going to keep it initially at just those kind of wider vertical brick pieces. So these really smaller ones here, I initially was like, it's probably not really necessary, just it's a little more time consuming and doesn't really add a whole lot. But looking at it, I was like, I'll try it out, see what it looks like, and if it adds enough, a little more detail, then I'll keep doing it all the way around. And it turned out I thought it looked really nice, so I figured I might as well keep it. The only downside being is it definitely took a lot of time to do this, and unfortunately, as I already mentioned, I had to cut out everything else in this episode, just for the sake of making not a super long episode. But so I also used these door and window props, which I think the window props are relatively new, because there was really never any decent window props on the workshop, which I was always surprised. And even with the door props, they were relatively limited, at least on generic ones, because there's a really nice door prop or asset collection of door props that I'm subscribed to, but they're pretty much all very modern. They have, then also they're kind of fairly industrial, so they have some markings on there, which unfortunately most of them I can't really use, but there are a couple that I use, and since it's a pack, I basically get all 20 or whatever of them. But these doors and windows are just very generic and simple enough that they can pretty much be used for whatever, whenever, unless of course you're making something really intricate or fancy, in which of course some simple glass door or glass window isn't really necessarily realistic. It's going to be a little more fancy and stuff. But yeah, since this is a fairly modern building, at least, of course, relative to the time period, they work perfectly fine. But so, yeah, here is the little pointed triangular things that I mentioned earlier that I don't think was in the original building. So I think this was added after renovations. And I didn't notice that or realize that until after I already built it and recorded all this. And when I was looking at pictures, and like I said, the modern ones have these, whereas the pictures of during the 1980s and 1990s, when it was falling apart, the stadium, I didn't actually see it. So I figured I'd still keep it because it adds a nice little touch to the top rather than just having that really square cube shaped building, which is a downside when using this technique because of course everything is built out of cubes and you can only really have things that are shaped as cubes or rectangles. So just adding that small touch there, just those kind of pointed tops there, definitely helps make it look a little more realistic because it looked a little flat beforehand. But another thing I want to do is add this trim here, this brick trim. Just once again trying to add something else just to make it so it doesn't look super flat. And it definitely helped out as well. But one thing that I've noticed since I've used this method several times is no matter how perfectly lined up these things are, so like as you can see here, right, as I'm dragging across this brick texture here, it keeps kind of popping up, popping forward, and even though it's perfectly parallel to the other, I guess the main structure there, it just doesn't stay lined up, and it's the most obnoxious thing ever. And I don't really know why it does that. So I often find myself, even though things are perfectly lined up, using, move it, of course, to ensure that they are, I still find that it does that, and I always have to kind of go back and make slight corrections to make sure everything is perfectly lined up. Yeah, again, it's really weird considering you would imagine if everything's lined up, you wouldn't really run into that issue, considering just using procedural objects to drag it across. But for whatever reason, it is like that. So small thing, but when you're trying to, not take too long, it can be a little annoying. But I also added those surfaces there on top just because one thing when it comes to these textures is anything facing the sky, so anything facing straight up essentially, doesn't really look good. So it really doesn't matter whatever texture you use. Even if it's a really dark texture, the whatever side is facing the sky just looks really, really bright, and you lose out on all detail. It just kind of looks very plain, and in this case, since it's kind of yellow and light, it looks very blinding almost. So it's not a good look. So I always try and cover it up with something to get rid of that kind of ugly shine, which definitely makes a big difference. But then, so at this point now, I basically did all the hard things, which was kind of just doing those brick highlights, making sure those were lined up, making sure they were evenly spaced and everything. That was definitely the biggest time consuming effort there, making sure they were evenly spaced. But in the end, it definitely, I think, turned out really cool. And like I already mentioned, I'm definitely glad I took the time to put all those details into it. So that finishes up the front side of the building here. But I wanted to revisit this side. And obviously, there needs to be something so the spectators and people going to watch the game can actually get to their seats. And at this point, I didn't have any way for the people to get up here. So I wanted to add this little thing here. And it's actually, the main part is a vanilla asset. It's for shopping carts, after you take your shopping cart out to your car, load up your groceries, this is where you return the carts to. I can't think of what you would call it. But since I obviously didn't want to have seats on the inside of that, since of course that's would be flat, that's where you'd walk out to your seats, I just used those door gate prop things just to put them in front, kind of cover it up so it doesn't look like there's actual seats or stairs there, since obviously that would not work in real life. But so now I wanted to add the second row of seating here, once again still using the staircase networks, which are very convenient for this, and using the node controller there to kind of widen them. I do wish I could have widened it a bit more. Unfortunately, I did it as much as possible, up to 200% there, because I think it would have been a little nicer if it wasn't so steep. But at the same time, now that I'm thinking about it, this makes it a little more compact, the seating, since I was relatively limited on space here, since in real life this is a pretty large area, and I skipped out on, for instance, the large park that's directly east of the stadium in real life. I didn't even build that since I didn't have any room. So I guess actually it might have been a good thing that this was limited to only 200% widening it. But it still looks good, and since I didn't really have to worry about adding seats or anything, since I believe there were none back when it was built, since even with renovations today, most or about half of it, not including the main grandstand, of course, but most of the seating today is, I'm pretty sure, just as it was back then, just with the concrete, more or less, steps like this. So that's certainly convenient, because obviously it would not have been possible to add seats all the way around. That would have been the most tedious thing on earth, and would have driven me absolutely insane. But yeah, the other thing that's a little weird with these steps here is at certain angles you get kind of just you'll probably already noticed now that I'm saying this, but you get kind of like weird, kind of glitchy effects with the networks there. I think it's just due to the fact that there's so many horizontal lines just kind of lined up right next to each other like that. You just kind of get those weird shadows and stuff, which is a little unfortunate. Also, the LOD is pretty crappy and kicks in at a very short distance. So, small thing, but can't really get any decent distant aerial photos because it's pretty ugly, the LOD. But aside from that, I'm so glad that, this is what I chose to use here, because I really couldn't think of anything else to use. At least it would make it as simple as this. It's just taking the network and dragging it all the way around, and also allowed me to make the stadium partially sunken, since I do believe that is how it was in real life. So if you look at it, basically the ground level is the very top of the lower level seating there. So you'd walk in and either go up or down to your seating. And I wanted to make it partially sunken, since, like I said, I think that's how it was in real life. But also, I just like sunken stadiums in general. I think they're kind of cool, which instead of, walking up to most of the seats are walking down. And it's just not very common, at least, here in the US. Not really sure in Europe or whatever. But when there is a stadium like that, I do like them. And they're typically much older. So, yeah, just in general, kind of the history and such. Another thing that I wanted to make sure I included was seats, such as these seats here in the corner, where you'd have essentially zero visibility if you were, say, watching a game. Because I feel like it's not an authentic old stadium unless there's seats in which literally half the field isn't visible. Because at least, again, in the US, with stadiums that are pretty old, that is very common. So I figured I might as well capture something similar to that and put in some seats that would essentially have no visibility of the field. But yeah, so lastly, just to wrap up this episode, placing these kind of railings all the way around just to make it look a little more like their seats, since realistically you'd have some sort of railings or kind of more walkway that didn't look exactly the same as the seating. So I wanted to have some sort of way to distinguish, even if it was very minimal. And then also, as we get to the end here, I wanted to add some actual real seating in the grandstands, since I imagine that's where people would actually pay a little more for their tickets, so they want to actually have real seats and not just be sitting on concrete. So that's the very final thing that we do in this episode. But yeah, so I asked you in the previous episode if you want to see more new stuff built, or kind of go back to updating some of the older things as we have been doing recently. And you pretty much all said you want to see new, which is kind of good, because I just had trouble getting motivated updating the older things. So I'll probably do some of it off camera and save some of the more unique, cooler things, of course, for actual episodes. But I think for the most part, some of the updating is just going to be off camera, since it seems as though that's what most of you are interested in as well. So just keeping it that way, and that way we can focus definitely more on newer builds, which of course are always more fun for everyone. But so that is going to do it for this episode. Hopefully you all enjoyed this one and enjoyed the focus on basically just one thing. And I definitely enjoyed building the stadium for sure. So if you did enjoy it, definitely give the video a thumbs up. Helps out the channel a lot. And if you're new, then definitely subscribe as well. Not sure what we're going to be building in the next episode, if we're going to be staying around this area or maybe going to a different part of the city. But whatever it is, I will see you all next time.